So, welcome everyone to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show focusing on the innovators and game changers that are working to move the human story forward. I'm Amanda Christensen, a guest interviewer, and I'm here with Niall Donnellan of the History Machine podcast. Niall, if you could introduce yourself and tell me a bit about your background, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thanks very much first for having me. I am Niall. I am the co-host of the History Machine podcast along with Cathal O'Gorman. And my background is primarily in biomedical engineering, but I have a keen interest in AI and history, and hence that kind of mashes together to make the podcast that we do. I work in the biomedical sector and in medical device production. So my podcasting is purely a hobby, and it's hopefully somewhere down the line it'll become more than just a hobby. It might become, the main job. We don't know. But for the meantime, it's just getting involved and interested in AI technology and history and trying to meld them all together.
Brilliant. So if you could give me a bit of an introduction into kind of how you came up with the idea for the History Machine podcast, as well as the science behind it, going into the neural network, how it records and tests information, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Okay, so to begin, a couple of years ago, Cathal and I came across in an article, and it was a very, very clickbaity article. And the subject was, Napoleon is the greatest general according to math, hands down, no questions asked. That was the basis of it. So naturally, as I said, I'm a person who's quite interested in history, so I was wondering, how did they come to this conclusion? So clicked on it, and it was a very, very basic statistical analysis of military history. So it just used kind of a win-loss chart, and I believe it used some raw analysis. But anyway, long story short, it grouped a lot of commanders together, and it said if you had, the most amount of battles and the most amount of wins, you were the best. And unfortunately for us, Napoleon in that area, because he's so relatively recent, he has a huge amount of battles recorded because they're in written history, and it's only at the tail end of the 19th century that he was around, and it meant that there was a lot of information on him, and there was no way that he could have lost with this very basic concept. So Cathal and I had a conversation. We said, if we really, really had to tackle this problem, we really had to decide who's the best commander, and not just best tactically, but best in a pinch or best at specific aspects, how would we actually do it? And Cathal came around to the idea that we could really, really tackle this with a neural network. So I'm not sure if the listeners are familiar with a neural network, but effectively it's a type of AI that is fed information. And in our case, we fed it information like battles, dates, unit types, army compositions, whether or not it was an ambush, whether or not the battle was a siege, when it happened in history, who was involved, what was the officer corps. So it's a huge amount of detail just flooded into this neural network. And it effectively crunches away using an algorithm to try and determine what exactly are the results, how can it come to this conclusion? And it churned out a lot of very interesting information for us. So ultimately, it was able to tell us the commander's win over expectation, which is probably the most important factor it came up with, which is in a given situation with this commander at this age and this time, what are the odds that they would win against the odds? So I'm rambling a little bit back and forth there now about it, but after we had that little brainchild of how we were going to do this, I decided, you know what, I'm going to do a lot of research. We'll fire away at this neural network. You'll build and develop it. We'll go through the bugs and the kinks and everything, and we'll come up with a proper big output of results. And then we'll study people throughout history and see who were like the big key players and why.
Perfect. So can you tell me about kind of some interesting results that you found from it? Maybe your kind of favorite results that you found?
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, very famous people tend to come out on top, and they're famous for a reason. We did have several people who scored particularly well and particularly poorly, and some of them were explainable and not explainable. So, for example, Julius Caesar scored tremendously well. And Julius Caesar, everybody just knows about him. He was never actually the emperor of Rome, but he effectively launched a coup, took over, was declared dictator for a certain amount of time, gets the whole, killed on the 15th of March, has an affair with Cleopatra. There's a whole little rigmarole, but he scored particularly well, so we weren't surprised about him. Another would have been Alexander the Great, scored phenomenally well, but that's because he was never defeated. He had a very long campaign. He started his own conquest at the age of 19, died at 32. And so these were the real obvious ones. There was one particular person who we did not expect, and he was quite out there and turned out to be our best commander up until the year 0 AD, roughly. And this was a fella called Cornelius Felix Sulla. Now, he's a strange. Have you ever heard of Sulla before?
I
Does
haven't.
the
No.
name ring a bell? Okay, that's very fair. So it almost appears to be you almost have to have a degree in classics to know who this person is. But long story short, he is one generation before Julius Caesar. And he himself did everything that Julius Caesar did faster, better, more efficiently, and laid the blueprints of everything that would have to be done to take over a country, and became dictator, not for life, but until he decided to retire. He died of a stomach ulcer in retirement after being dictator, after being a brutal dictator for a very long time. And when he died, he was given a full state funeral and none of his family were interfered with. So effectively, he's a person who was so out there, so over the top, so unbelievable that he was able to make himself dictator of ancient Rome, rule with an iron fist, retire as anyone today would retire, which is like, if you could possibly think what modern dictators can retire. And even after he dies, nothing seems to happen to him. So he was this larger than life, super charismatic individual. And it was only because of the results that were churned out of the machine that we even decided to delve into him that deeply. And we do not regret doing it. Other people that score very high, Cleopatra, we name dropped her a little bit earlier. And there are people then who actually score quite low, even though they might have been specifically great historical figures. And that would indicate that their military ability is reasonable. I'm not going to say bad, but reasonable, but they have compensated it with political abilities.
Right.
For example, we have Ptolemy the First of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of Alexander's sub-commanders. He's considered one of the best commanders of Alexander, but tactically, which is what our history machine neural network recorded, he didn't score particularly too well. But then we had to look at his actual political and strategic achievements, and you would probably say that in the War of the Successors, he was probably the winner. So the history machine looks at him and says, he's not actually fantastic as a commander on the battlefield, especially when he's by himself. But if we look at his overall lifelong achievements, he still shows like a phenomenal score.
That's quite interesting. So what sort of, you mentioned obviously the data from individual battles and campaigns and kind of length of time and cause of death and things like that, as well as
Yes.
the political side of things. So what kind of data points are you feeding into this neural network for it to consider?
It's a very good question. There's a lot that's fed into it. It's the main information though is who's in charge of the army, who is their officer corps. So it'll very often understand that these people are up and coming or that they're lieutenants and commanders and sergeants and so on. It will know the amount of people that are involved in the battle, the casualties, the unit composition. So it might be, is it legionnaires? Is it horseback cavalry? Is it, it could be anything. Is it warships? What exactly is the person bringing to the battlefield? We also inform it of information like, was it an ambush? Was it a siege? The amount of time that the battle took as well. It might be something that, this could be a siege that took years. We would feed it information that would be the time that it happened in the world as well, because it'll very often observe a pattern that at this given century, at this given time, with these particular unit compositions, we see there might be an advantage or disadvantage. We also tell it the region of the world that it happens. So that makes things quite interesting if we have cross pollination between different cultures, where we'll say this is now where the East meets the West, or this is where Persia finally takes on the Greeks, or this is where, how fair do Italians fare against Phoenicians and so on. It's able to factor in and work out that kind of information as well. I'm trying to think of some of the other information that it's generally fed. It does know if the army is veteranized, but it kind of calculates that itself based on who's in charge of it. So it's not unexpected that if an army lasts a long time, it suddenly becomes the house favorite. The history machine does understand that this army has been around a long time. It has been winning. It has a decent record. Uh, and that would generally be the information that is input. There's modifications and slight tweaks and changes to it. Now, when I say tweaks and changes as well, the current history machine that we use is an algorithm-based neural network, although Cathal is modifying it, and we're just about finished modifying it for season 2 to make it work a little bit better with the technology we have, because we don't have a crazy amount of processing power as much as everyone has with their current laptops and graphics cards and phones that, you know, anyone in NASA in the 1960s would have killed to have our technology. Um, the kind of stuff that we have now just isn't that supercomputer level that, let's say, a government or someone might be using. So we've had to make modifications and tweaks based on the limitations of the equipment we actually have. So we're quite happy with that. We're also very aware that the information that we input can be very biased. Mm-hmm. I have really tried to limit that as much as I can, although the neural network itself will compensate to a certain extent for bias of information that comes into it. And that's because if we try and keep our, our biases unbiased or consistent, it will factor and calculate that. So we see that a lot for a lot of these really old battles. You'll find that, like, if the Romans lose a battle, they always seem to have lost a battle against 100,000 savages. You know, so the computer very much picks up of like, okay, hold on a second, you're very much over exaggerating this. This is definitely a trend I can observe, that you only seem to lose under those circumstances. And so we've tried to modify it as much as we can for that kind of a thing. And the unit composition has really helped, because sometimes there are battles like that where we might say, you know, the enemy was heavily outnumbered or undernumbered, or it doesn't matter, the ratios were mad. But if it's just militia against fully trained soldiers, you know that was going to go one way anyway. So the neural network is fantastic at working that out. It gives us very interesting results. We have modified it to do fantasies because we have done bonus episodes. One of them was on Game of Thrones, which was very fun. Our rough calculation was a dragon was worth 1 million men. and we're in the works of doing one for Lord of the Rings as well. So because of the updates with the neural network and with the history machine at the moment, we're able to interchange fantasy and non-fantasy quite quickly now, which is really good for kind of bonus and joke episodes where we'll investigate something like that and see what can be done. So multifunctional in that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's
Mm-hmm.
really fascinating. And in kind of talking about, you were speaking about bias as well as the
Yes.
different data points that are being added in. Is there kind of an estimated degree of accuracy? I know you cannot give an exact estimate, but
Yes, it's a very good question. It would be quite difficult to answer, because when you do train a neural network, you don't want to over or under train it, because you can get wildly bad results. So when we come to the accuracy, it's quite, I won't be able to put a precise number on this, and I will justify my reasons for it. The ancient sources that we pull most of our information from now are wildly exaggerated anyway. So where we find information that we can try and correct it, where we say, actually, it wasn't 80,000 men, it was 62,000 or something, or whatever it is, we correct that where we can. Now, overall, the history machine itself, with that certain amount of bias and exaggeration, is able to come to a reasonable amount of accuracy. If I was to pick a number, I'd say 85%. But we couldn't be 100% certain on the absolute accuracy of it. Now, we have had discussions before with other people on, should we train it with modern information first? But unfortunately, that's not really something viable we can do, and there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is modern warfare has virtually no connection to ancient warfare. The operations and logistics involved in modern warfare involve like tanks, airplanes, armor, different calibers of weapon, firepower, the amount of energy, the output, the finance, the backing. So it's apples and oranges when we try and compare that to a couple of guys with spears and shields. So it's just not the same. And I'd love to be able to pull together that information and say, hey, this thing is trained, and we've trained on modern warfare with modern weapons, and now we're just going to connect it to phalanx grease. And unfortunately, that can't be done for the reasons I've just stated. And also, it's because warfare has changed so drastically. Hand-to-hand combat is nearly non-existent in modern warfare, and it is the bread and butter of ancient. So it's one that we kind of have to work with what we have. And as biased as some of it can be, we try and correct those biases as much as possible. Uh, Now, I do have to say as well, Cathal and I, neither of us are professional historians. We're just hobbyists. We're both engineers, and we're both very interested in history. We're both very interested in AI and engineering and applying analytics. But this is just a little bit of a fun project, and after having a lot of conversations and a lot of back and forth on who's better and who's why, and we've dated to follow it. That's why we have a podcast, and that's why we said let's discuss this. Let's talk about, who would win in a fight, and that's I did not mention this, but that is a very important issue of the neural network and the history machine. We can pit commanders against each other, which is very often the who would win in a fight, Alexander or Julius Caesar, or why would somebody do this for what particular reason? And then we could run a simulated battle where we said, well, if this did break out in a civil war, there's a good chance that Alexander would have been overthrown. Or, there's lots of little what ifs that we can actually test because we have the information and because we have the commanders and because we have the unit types.
So in those kind of what if scenarios, are you getting kind of a percentage of victory?
Yes, we definitely are. Some of the outputs of the commanders are interesting because we find people who win against the odds, but we also find different aspects of different commanders. And we also see that there are highs and lows. People peak at specific times. So to give you an example, Hannibal Barca, he's the guy who marched the elephants over the Alps and gave Rome the hardest time of their life. He peaked at 27. So we look at the age of his existence and how long he was around, the battles he was in. But a 27-year-old Hannibal Barca is practically unbeatable in the ancient world. He's just sharp, he's focused, he's absolutely in the prime of his life. By the time he's 50, he's an average commander. And it's just that could actually insinuate that possibly maybe there could have been something. Now I am very heavily speculating here, but it could insinuate something like maybe he had maybe his health deteriorated, that he might have developed something like Alzheimer's, or he got slower, or he just couldn't quite keep up. But the super sharp mind of a 27-year-old Hannibal is incredible. Another similar example we have is Alexander only gets better with age. Now he dies at 32, but he just keeps getting better and better and better. There's a couple of other examples I was going to try and think of there now, but they've dropped dropped out of my head. Oh yes, sorry. Between like the Alexander and the Caesar, Alexander the Great has a great chance of winning a battle. He doesn't have the best. He's not the person who wins against the odds. However, his army and his commanders and Macedonian commanders of the time, so these are people who would have studied under him, have the highest percentage of killing an enemy commander. So it turns out that we've observed different styles of warfare from different people. And one of them is that if it's a Macedonian Greek commander, they almost always go, I'm going to ride across this battlefield with a lot of horsemen and try and kill the enemy king or queen or general or whoever's there and wipe out their officer corps. That just turned out to be their style of army, their style of battling. And if we look at some Roman commanders, they almost have something that's a little bit different of, we're going to have this very long slugfest of a battle, and I'm actually not going to lose many troops, but the way that my army is laid out and the formations and the setup, I'm very well quite protected, and we'll just very slowly chip away at all of your people. So there's all of these different kinds of aspects of warfare. And then when we do battles of one versus the other or fictitious battles, we end up with percentages. So for the Alexander and Julius Caesar example, we work out that out of 21 battles, Alexander should win 11. Julius Caesar should win 11. But 7 of the ones that Alexander wins is Alexander personally killing Julius Caesar. So that's just what it thinks. Yeah, that these are the kind of the stats that the history machine will churn out. So similar to maybe footballers or or professional fighters or anything. There's different aspects and different types of style and different gameplay that give them these different percentages. So we see that the Macedonian commanders just like to kill the enemy king, and the Romans like to wipe out the enemy army.
It's fascinating. So kind of moving
Yeah. Yeah.
into modernity, I know Cathal has his sports podcast.
Yes, yes, yes. Cathal actually started the Cathal actually started the sports podcast before we ever did the history neural network. Now, the history neural network is a little more complicated because it's got so much more input information. But Cathal is a fan of GAA, which is Gaelic athletics. It would be very, very popular in Ireland. And he effectively pulled together another neural network that he used information from wins and losses and was able to determine percentages of what are the odds, what are the upsets, who does he think is going to win the league, who does he think is going to win the championship. Now, funnily enough, these kind of neural networks are very commonly used by, we'll say, gambling companies, because they like to be able to go, well, what kind of odds should we pay out to someone, or what kind of things should we input here, and how are we looking, and what kind of vig or percentages should we set. So Cathal has very often had to remind his audience for this specific podcast, please do not bet with this information, because it's only about 45% accurate, and based on those percentages you're going to lose money. So please don't do it. Because you can have a few people who give a try, but yeah, that is Cathal's other podcast is called Take Your Data Points, and it is with Gaelic hurling in Ireland. It's quite interesting. It's very good, and because it's a very popular sport in Ireland, it's a good one to follow, and it's a great one to understand, and you can really relate to the upsets when they do happen. And for example, last year Galway, where I'm from, were knocked out of the championship, and it only happened because there was a draw between two other counties. And there was a draw between Galway and somebody, and two other counties had a win-loss situation, but the odds of that happening was 7%. So it was a very strange one, but there we go. We're able to put a percentage on the chance of the upset, and that was it. Mm-hmm.
So now kind of like extrapolating that to major moments in history, like the one we're living in today, how can neural networks be used to record history and kind of almost bypass or create a greater sense of accuracy and unbiased information with this vast amount of information that's being poured onto the internet today?
Good question. There is a vast amount of data, and we all know that data is very valuable, and there's so much of it around, and it's gathered and shared and stored in servers everywhere. I would have to say that the neural network can only be as unbiased, and for the history that will be recorded from now until the future will only be as accurate as the information it's fed. Now, luckily for us, the kind of information that we're gathering right now, it's not by an ancient or author like Plutarch or someone who's writing with a cultural aspect in mind. We're just going to have sheets and sheets of data that's going to be gathered and can be fed into similar or more advanced networks down the line that will give us kind of obvious maybe trends and predictions. So it would be very, very useful to record for history for the future. Now, one of the only issues with this, and this is an interesting little side note that I've come across before, somebody once told me that the Rosetta Stones of the future, are you familiar with the Rosetta Stone? Yeah.
Yes.
But the Rosetta Stones of the future are going to be instruction manuals for IKEA furniture, because they have every language on them, and we're going to have hundreds of words for Phillips and flathead screwdriver. But the logic and reasoning is the kind of data that we're storing and we're keeping it on hard drives and servers. Some of that technology is only going to be kept preserved for a few hundred years. Now, in our minds, that's incredible, because I think a VHS video is dead in 20 years. A CD might last, it could be 30, 40 years. I'm not 100% sure on that one. And it's a hard drive will last about 100. But the idea is, as impressive as that is, and the grand scale of history, the information that we're currently storing, a lot of it is, as important and valuable as it is, a lot of it is going to get lost. And it will only be proper cataloged information like that that's going to last in the long term, and physical copies. So the advantage of a neural network for all of this information gathered is if we could crunch these trillions of data points and come with reasonable outputs and have those physically printed and bound and kept safe and secure, they could last millennia. So that's probably the real advantage of something like a neural network or AI in action, is to make sense of the trillions of data points. Because currently there's just so much information out there and it's constantly being gathered and updated. No one really knows what to do with it. And it's this kind of black box technology that might have the answers.
Fantastic. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if that is the kind of way that history is recorded moving forward, and a way to remove as much bias as possible. There's no way to remove the bias.
Yeah, there's no way to remove the whole thing. It really depends on what's gathered, what's input, and what's whatever. But because everything's been currently being gathered, which is kind of scary at the same time, that's kind of in itself removing a lot of it too. So
Exactly.
it really helps it in that sense.
You're seeing things from both sides of the bias, or as many sides. There's never just two sides, unfortunately. Moving on from that, are there any kind of sources of inspiration, people who have really inspired you along your journey, whether it be in creating this podcast, looking into neural networks, programming?
There definitely is. The one person who's inspired me for the podcast side is Dan Carlin from the Hardcore History podcast series. And if you haven't heard him, just take some time out of your day, go onto YouTube or just Google it, Dan Carlin Hardcore History. He has several episodes that are free. There are others that can buy. I don't think you could spend money right now better than buying, 20 hours of solid podcasting from him. The man is a genius. He's a master storyteller. He's just able to convey this information so well. Well, I mentioned Sulla earlier. We have an episode on him, but Dan Carlin goes so in depth into the man. He's an over the top figure. I could rant on and on. I might do that later, but Dan Carlin from the Hardcore History podcast is probably the biggest inspiration. As for anyone from the tech side, I can't really jump to a specific person because the kind of technology we're using is so new. There's no standout person in the industry. There's no Steve Jobs of neural networks at the moment.
Right.
And once again, we're kind of hobbyists as well, so it's only a kind of a side project we're really involved with, more so working on this, and it's much more for entertainment purposes as well. Now the science is there, the data is there, the information is there, speculation is rampant, but that's the kind of stuff that we like to hammer away at and work at. So there's no one really from the technological side that we'd like to aspire to, but in my opinion, Dan Carlin from Hardcore History, he is just, if I could be half as good as him, I would be delighted.
Fantastic. So in a similar vein, past, present, future, is there anyone that you would love to meet?
Now, I mentioned him several times, and I'm going to give a little bit of a backstory to this guy, but I would have to meet Sulla. I've discussed this with a few people before, I've talked about it, but I'll give a little background for who Sulla is and why he would be an interesting person. So he was a blue-blooded person from the heights of any Roman aristocrats at all. He was born with no money, so he had to hang around with prostitutes and gladiators and actors and people who would have been considered the dregs of society at the time. But he was somebody who was so unbelievably charming. He was able to convince these people, give me some money, work with me, see what I can do. I'm going to make a career for myself. But because he was a blue-blooded person, he also had these connections to the upper parts of society. So sometimes you come across people who are very intelligent, but they don't have any common sense. We probably all know those people day to day, and they mightn't be able to speak in public. They mightn't be able, they can't quite form social relationships. But Sulla is this larger than life person who is undeniably intelligent, but he is so emotionally intelligent at the same time and socially aware that he is able just to do absolutely phenomenal things. So he starts from almost a kind of a dregs of the bottom, charms his way through the whole situation, finds himself in charge of Rome, finds himself actually elected as consul, which is, for those who aren't too familiar with it, Rome had two presidents. Most democracies and republics are based on the Roman system. So we all have senators and we have houses and so on, and different ranks and titles. But in the Roman system, they were paranoid that somebody could take control of everything. So they elected two presidents a year. And that that rank was known as consul. So Sulla is able to get himself from the very bottom of society all the way up to the guy who's in charge of Rome, or one of two people. He finds himself in a situation where he's in Greece, he's bogged down, he's got an army, and he's going to make some money, because when Roman commanders found themselves with armies, they do pretty bad things, but this is how you would make cash. Effectively, you're going to start enslaving people, or you're going to start looting cities, you're going to start whatever, and you're just going to tear apart another country and bring home as much wealth as possible. Which is why if you go and visit Rome, you're going to find that they've loads of monuments, like, you know, obelisks from Egypt and different monuments from different places. That's why they're there. But Sulla is the first person in Roman history to break their cardinal rule, and that's to never march on Rome. And he does it so he can simply become dictator of Rome, force himself into a position of power to complete the job he was democratically elected to do, then change the whole situation, purge all of his enemies, go back to his war campaign, come back and have a second civil war and purge all of his enemies. And as I said, he will eventually get sick of what he's doing. He's like, I don't really like being dictator all the time. He will retire just to party for the rest of his life, and he'll die of a stomach ulcer. And his epitaph, which is, this is the man is ridiculous, but his epitaph is "No better friend, no worse enemy." So he just seems to be this unbelievable party animal slash super intelligent out there person, and he's done, as I said, he's done everything Julius Caesar did, but arguably better, quicker, faster. In fact, Julius Caesar, as a teenager, will flee Rome and will only return after Sulla is dead, because he's so terrified of him.
It's quite
So
interesting.
it's
If
yeah,
he's
he's a very, very interesting person.
Yeah, if
So
power, Julius Caesar might have never come to be then.
well, definitely. Now, as I said, I could talk about this forever, but Julius Caesar will do everything Sulla does, except he will change several things in the plan. So they both march on Rome. They both command a certain amount of legions. They both decide to name themselves dictator, but Julius Caesar will do one thing different from Sulla, and he will decide to pardon everybody while Sulla kills all of his enemies. And because of that, Julius Caesar gets knifed several times on the Ides of March, and Sulla has literally no one to knife him. It is said at the end of his life he could walk down Rome without bodyguards, because anyone who had ever thought anything bad against him was no longer around. Uh, so, as I said, he seems to be a brutal person, but fascinating, interesting, and if you were on his good side, you were living a pretty nice life. So, as I said, he's a fascinating individual, Sulla, and Augustus, who is Octavian, that would be Julius Caesar's nephew, who was adopted as his son, will look at the life of Julius Caesar and look at the life of Sulla and say, I know Sulla did it better. And Augustus, who's considered in Roman history by the Romans themselves, and this is maybe a little bit nostalgic, they would say he's the best emperor they ever had, but he just followed the Sulla plan as well. So Sulla's the guy who invents the way of how to do things. Doesn't really get any credit for it, as bad as the things he might have done are, but it to be around or in the room with someone of that level of just absolute charismatic ability, because he was also meant to be an unbelievably charming person, like to the point where there was a battle in Greece where an army was raised to go against him. This is when he decided to march on Rome, and his troops met the opposing troops. They saluted each other, and the other army just diffused into his. I went, yeah, I'd prefer to be with Sulla. He's just a pretty cool guy. So, so as I said, he's a fat. Like, if you got any time, read up on him. He's an unbelievably. If he was alive today, he could very easily be a CEO of Google. There'd be no questions asked. He's just this larger than life person.
It's been absolutely fascinating talking about the History Machine podcast.
You're all right, yeah.
And kind of speaking about how this can filter into modernity and in the past, and pitting emperors against one another. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you again for taking the time today.
You're very, very welcome, and thanks very much for having me.